Good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to our next session of the BSHS Digital Festival 2023 on immersive storytelling. I'm now handing over to Karen and wish you a pleasant session.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are in the world. I am Karen Rader, professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University, coming to you from Richmond, Virginia in the US. And as Alexander said, we're in the session Immersive Storytelling, History of Science, Technology, and Popular Culture, Part 1, Creating, where we will be hearing brief presentations from 3 scholar practitioners doing fascinating work in various immersive storytelling media and spaces. And then we will have what I hope will be an enriching and mind-expanding discussion for all of us about what these collaborative and co-mediated spaces mean for sharing ideas about what we know, how we know it, and what we may come to know, and for the future of the history of science, knowledge making, and use. So before I get too carried away with the abstract goals, I want to mention that our session has a part 2 taking place tomorrow. Check the program for your time. It is arranged and hosted by my collaborator, Katherine Pandora at the University of Oklahoma. Its focus is on participating and specifically on video gaming as an interactive medium for teaching and learning history of science and technology. So we are delighted to have you here, and we hope that you will join us for this part 2, which is taking place as an open discussion on Discord. I think Alexander is going to post a link to the Discord server in the Q&A. And in fact, at the Discord server, the panelists for this session have posted some preliminary answers to questions that Katherine and I identified as thematically key. So if you are inclined, you can simulcast Discord and participate in the discussion there during and after this very session, as well as in the one tomorrow. So I think I want to start above all, Katherine and I would like to thank BSHS and its Digital Festival Planning Committee, who embraced our innovations and somehow saw fit to assign us a festival Zoom webinar platform today. I have been deeply impressed. I haven't been able to log into a lot of things live, but I've seen some things afterward, and I've been deeply impressed with the level and variety of sessions. And I really hope that our session is a challenging and useful discussion that continues in and after the meeting. And for questions that we don't get to in the Q&A, which is where you will be asked to post your questions by clicking on Q&A at the bottom of your screen, Discord offers us some options for posting them there to continue the conversation. So turning then to the structure of our remaining time together, a few guideposts. We're going to run the session as a 90-minute session, not using the full 2 hours allotted to give folks time to take longer human breaks or pop in and pop out, kind of essential while working in digital spaces. First, we will have remarks from each of our panelists who have shifted a bit over the last month, but now consist of 3 folks, Ivan Amato, Fabrizio Nevola, and Alexis Peck. And I will introduce each one, and then they will speak for about 10 minutes. Then I will allow them to ask questions of one another since they are the experts. And I will follow up with any brief thematic questions that I might devise to link the presentations. And then the bulk of the session is going to be devoted to your questions, which can be posted, again, standard web Zoom webinar style by clicking on Q&A, which I will moderate. So to get started, speaker number 1 is Ivan Amato. Ivan Amato is a science and technology writer, editor, communicator, podcaster, and publication professional, now based in Montclair, New Jersey. He has written several books, including the most recent, Taking Technology Higher, the Naval Center for Space Technology and the Ascent of the Space Age. And you can ask him about the self-described security check and saga that led to its publication in 2022. But spoiler, it has absolutely nothing to do with any documents leaked on a closed Discord server chat group. Ivan has published articles in various mainstream and specialized media outlets. Further, he has worked as a consultant for the President's Council of Advisors for Science and Technology, the Lemelson Center, the Chemical Heritage Foundation, and done broadcast stints with National Public Radio and Discovery Communications Science Channel. Finally, about which you may hear today, he created and hosted the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, DARPA, DARPA's first podcast, Voices from DARPA. And in recent years, he has introduced a live channel communication into his mix by founding 2 Science Cafe series, the DC Science Cafe in Washington, with which I was familiar, and also Cafe KITP in Santa Barbara, California. So Ivan, take it away.
First, a round of thank yous, and to you, Karen. That was, I don't know who that guy was you were talking about, but it was a little fun for me to hear about that. The last thing, actually in the bio, is my current position. I'm now the Science Communications Manager of the Zuckerman Mind-Brain Behavior Institute, which is at Columbia University. But also thanks to BSHS, to you, Karen and Katherine, for even thinking of having me participate. To Fabrizio and hopefully Alexis, my co-panelist when she comes in. So I'm going to try to keep to the 10 minutes and say a little bit about the Science Cafe experiences, which really were quite immersive, I hope, for everybody who participated, a little bit about the podcast, and then actually a couple of other things at DARPA and where I am currently at the Zuckerman Institute. So the Science Cafe is something that I initiated a little bit more than a decade ago. So I've been a print reporter primarily for a long time, writing short form, long form books, as you've said. But I wanted, actually, in some ways, to make my job more amusing for myself. And so I had decided that I would try to create a live channel of communication. Print, as many of us here know, is you write things, you kind of throw them over the wall in some ways. It goes on paper, goes online. You hope, that it's having some kind of influence, that some people are enjoying what you're reading. And maybe every now and again you get some feedback. But a live channel like a Science Cafe, which, for those who haven't experienced it, goes something like this. You go to a place with friends where you would go for a social outing where you can get some coffee, maybe some alcohol, some food, and instead of relying entirely on your friends for entertainment and for the night's input, there is a fantastically interesting person in the science community, and someone like me, an organizer who then facilitates an evening discussion, which might begin with 10 or 15 minutes from I call them the discussion leaders, and then a room-wide discussion that would be facilitated by me. So I managed to get a partner in a way, the founder of a great series of restaurants, which are in DC, Washington, DC, called Busboys and Poets. And these are really cultural centers of the city. This is where there's a lot of social activism, there are a lot of book events, and then, kind of a sundry sort of list of events like the one that I created, DC Science Cafe. These were, I think, rewarding for everybody, certainly for me as the organizer, and in the performative aspect, which was really fun for me. And I would bring in astrophysicists, earth scientists, experts in the microbiome, engineering, ethics was a topic, art conservation and restoration, quantum physics, a few kind of book-based talks, new authors coming in. We even had science, poetry, and performance, even science comedians. It was really a very broad look at the scientific landscape. One of the platitudes I used when I ran these, because this is kind of where my own interest in science communication comes from, I would say to the audience, the greatest gift science has to offer is the opportunity to experience awe as science reveals how nature works. So that was one of the platitudes. And the other point of this was to really point out that science is part of culture, not apart from it. And that is why I organize these at in-town restaurants and not at a cathedral of science like the National Academies of Science, which is a perfectly good place to do it, but you're going to get the usual suspects there. What we had more often at Busboys and Poets was something like a representative cut of the general population, which is something that was really important to me. It was immersive in the sense that the way a play is immersive. So you're going to a place, to a venue. There was actually a stage, although that was not always used. People, my discussion leaders might just be at the front, or almost more like dinner theater, because you could also order food and drinks, which I think also made science a more welcome and friendly kind of subject matter to really embrace. So I'll leave that for the for the Science Cafe part of my discussion. Although I will say that I liked it so much that I did have an opportunity to organize a second series out at the Kavli Institute for Theoretical Physics. That's what KITP stands for, after KITP that Karen mentioned. I was there for a writing residency, and my give back for that was to establish a new cafe for them. And they were really interested in having a channel of communication to the community. So this was in a bar on State Street in Santa Barbara, beautiful, wonderful street. I got that going, ran the first one, and then handed the baton off, and that continues to run to this day. That began in 2014. DC Science Cafe began in 2011. That has been on hiatus, but someone is about to take the baton for that, so that will get restarted soon. So that's Science Cafes, and I will be happy to answer any questions people have about that, both organizationally and what the experience is like. Then I'm going to shift over now to the experience of creating the first podcast for a US DoD, Department of Defense organization, R&D organization called Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA. It's kind of a storied place, and it was born out of the Cold War. It was born just months after Sputnik went up with the mandate that if anybody's going to be doing technological surprising in the world, it's going to be the US, right? So that was sort of the idea of DARPA, and it's become a kind of mythic place for those who think a lot about innovation and technology development. And it's had its hand in a lot of these sort of technology developments that have characterized these technological times of ours. What I did, the impetus for creating this podcast was that I wanted to capture, if possible, some of the really fleeting sociocultural elements of what it means to run technology programs of these kinds. And these are really quite big. They often run for 3 to 5 years, and it could involve national treasure, which is to say, taxpayers' money in tens and even more than $100 million for particular projects. So these are really national investments. There's a lot that goes on, a lot of moving pieces. The way it generally works is a program manager conceives of the program and has to go through a vetting and approval process, and then that program manager essentially puts together from the scientific community. I mean, there's a kind of a call for proposals, and then from that, proposal makers are chosen by the program manager to get a set of mindsets and skill sets that will increase the chances of actually realizing what are really ambitious technology goals. So it's quite unique in putting together, kind of interdisciplinary teams that you almost don't see anywhere else, right? I mean, they're really teams that are all at the interfaces of, we typically think of different disciplines, and that goes across science and engineering, managerial innovations. All of these things have to come together in order for these programs and for the program managers to be successful. The format was very simple. It just sort of me and a program manager, generally between two ferns with a couple of microphones, having a discussion. The narrative arc for me, though, and this is where maybe the history of science comes in a little bit more, is I really would always get the sort of origin story of the program manager's interest in science and engineering in general, and then specifically why they might be interested in a particular technology development program, whether that's in aeronautics and a new kind of hypersonic vehicle, or whether it's new actually AI chips. DARPA's had a role in the history of artificial intelligence quite a bit, even since the 1960s. But really part of the impetus, as I said, was really to capture things that normally are transient and just disappear. So, how would the program manager go about getting approval? What would be the framing of this technology? What would be the promise that the program manager would give, say, to DARPA leadership? How were the relationships established between the program managers and the contractors? They were called performers, interestingly enough, because the contractors were expected to perform, reach certain goals, and they actually could be cut from the program if they didn't. And that's actually a really interesting and fairly unique aspect of the technology engine that is DARPA's, that is different from the way other technology-related agencies in the US work. And it's very mission-oriented. So I wanted to see if I could capture that, again, potentially for the interest of historians and just understanding the dynamics of technology development. So I did about 60, I did the podcast in two different sort of tours of duty. I started between 2016, 2018, then I went away and had another project outside of DARPA, went back, restarted it. In the end, by the time I left, there were about 60 of the podcast that I then handed off to my colleagues. This was in the Public Information Office there. And so that series now continues in a somewhat evolved form as it's being recreated by my former colleagues there. And also just from the history side, when we could talk about a current leading edge, sort of visionary, almost kind of technology idea, if I could bring that in, to the history of where this idea came from, that was part of at least some of the podcasts. And then I'll finish up with just two other things. I was at DARPA in 2018, which is when it was celebrating its 60th anniversary. And so I was involved in another immersive, sort of science communication, technology communication effort there, which was a pop-up museum. This was based on an innovation timeline that I had developed, which is on site there and on the website. And that actually involved reaching out to probably about 50 former contractors, performers, to get artifacts that came out of these programs. And these were put in vitrines and various displays. There was a kind of narrative that we created. There were little plaques on each for some understanding. And there was even a kind of curation, so you could have a little bit of a tour through this pop-up museum. Unbelievable to me that this was up for 3 days during the celebration. And it took, you can imagine how much effort it took to put all of this together. But that was a very interesting, immersive museum-like experience. And that was all about the history of the agency. And then finally, I'll mention just the current immersive experience, quasi-immersive. And this is at my current place of work, the Zuckerman Mind Brain Behavior Institute at Columbia University. This is not my work. This is actually the work of my colleagues Devin Powell and Matteo Farinella. It's called The Science Life. And what this is really, it's each element of the science life is a comic strip, about 6 frames, that tells the origin story or the motivation of someone in the whole scientific community, the diverse scientific community, involved in some kind of aspect of the neuroscience that goes on at the Zuckerman Institute. This was deliberately done with diversity in mind and not a focus on the kings and queens, the principal investigators of the labs. It really is all about everybody else. So the graduate students, the postdocs, the technicians, the animal handlers, everybody, in the village that it takes to really do science and pull off scientific discovery. So there's now about, I want to say 35, 40 of these 6-frame comic strips along 2 walls of a very large and high-ceilinged lobby in the Zuckerman Institute when you walk in there. And if you really spent time on each of those walls, just walking down each and reading all of these, you would have a better understanding of just what it takes to operate a lab and to be in it. I probably have gone over 10 minutes. Karen, you didn't give me any sign, but I presume it's there. I haven't even been looking at a clock. So I'm going to stop there and hand it over to Fabrizio and then await later to participate in the Q&A.
Thank you, Ivan. I want to just interrupt so that I can introduce Fabrizio.
Yes.
And to remind everyone that if you have questions that you're formulating as things are going along, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, clicking on the Q&A bubble at the bottom, or if you're on YouTube, you can go over into Zoom and put them in the Q&A or put them in Discord, excuse me. So hopefully everything will get to us by one of those channels. So our next speaker is Fabrizio Nevola, who I think currently holds 2 jobs at the University of Exeter, head of art history and visual culture and deputy head of Department for Languages, Cultures, and Visual Studies. But in his other non-administrative life, in a number of recent research projects, he has explored the use of mobile phone apps for different aspects of narrative and history, and in turn has worked with specialists in the field of digital media. Hidden Florence, released in 2018, is the result of one such collaboration with a GPS-triggered city audio tours company, Calvium Limited. It's a self-described idiosyncratic guide to Renaissance Florence, unquote, a very important city in the historiography of science and technology. And it takes the form of a mobile phone app, which I understand you can download and yourself use. This collaboration continued, expanded with some Getty Foundation funding with Immersive Renaissance, which explored how interoperable 3D models of Renaissance buildings can interact with real-world settings as AR experiences and GIS mapping. And I understand you can explore this yourself on something called the Florence 4D project website. One of his more recent experiments with 3D augmented reality for urban and gallery experiences resulted in the new and improved Hidden Florence 3D app, which was the UK Apps App of the Year AR/3D in 2020, singled out for its innovative use of 3D AR. So Fabrizio, take it away.
Thank you very much. And I think I'm going to talk much less about the 3D and more about the locative storytelling. So I hope that's going to be okay. I think there will probably already be a few overlaps with what Ivan was talking about just now, in particularly the sort of not kings and queens approach. I think if I was going to do the 3D stuff, it would be I would probably need another few minutes. So I think I'm going to leave that part out of it. But as you said, that can be found through the Florence 4D website, and also all these apps are free, by the way. Hidden Florence 3D, which is an app which allows you to experience a series of buildings that we've modeled and put artworks back into in one-to-one scale. The start point here is that I'm an art and architectural historian. So my position in relation to this work is that I'm an academic first, in a sense, and much of what I am doing here is taking that research in some ways and making it more public. So this is a sort of public history exercise, sometimes called public history. But on the other hand, something that I'm always really keen to underline is the fact that the approach, particularly to locative storytelling, has also changed some of the research that I do. So my relatively recent book called Street Life in Renaissance Italy is very much informed from the viewpoint of the viewer on the street. And that's really what the apps are doing. The sort of public history approach that I'm using is really instantiating, is the word I guess I use. It's actually doing what a number of turns in history in the recent maybe decades, have been doing. Spatial turns, material turns, mobile turns, experiential turns, all happen through the action of moving through a city in the company of an AR guide, a historically informed guide character who is the sort of storytelling vehicle through which we channel a whole series of sort of social, cultural history questions. My dog has just decided to stand up. The approach involves aspects of microhistory, critical fabulation, essentially filling in the gaps. What I am going to do is I'm actually going to illustrate the rest of this talk. So hopefully this is going to work. If something isn't working, please tell me. I'm just going to go to full screen so that you can see this properly. So basically the Hidden Cities apps and the QR code there on the screen will take you to a download. Started out, as you said, with Florence. We then added, through a series of funding, European funding, we added a series of 5 other apps, and we're currently building a whole series of others through direct, what's sometimes called contract research, where we do a project at a time based on whatever funding we can draw on. The idea of the apps, and this is really coming from the art history point of view, is that the affordances of smartphones have us staring at our screens a lot of the time, but they're also portable and incredibly powerful. And a phone, has a screen, it has audio, it can deliver maps, it can deliver screen text, it can deliver images, and it can package these all up in quite a neat way, which is, to be honest, incredibly little used by historians and art historians. And so our idea, my original idea back in 2014, and the most recent version of the Florence app is 2018, was to think about how the app could be used to tell history on location. This was the second round that expanded from one hidden city to multiple hidden cities, and you can see there the partners that were involved in that project there, and there's a website that supports that. Just to give you a brief flavor, and this is the only long video I'll run with the audio, but I just thought that this might be helpful to give you an idea of how the system works. Can you hear the audio?
Well,
oh, it always does that. Don't know why. I must be downloaded it wrong.
My name is Cosimo de' Medici.
October 1937. War is going badly for the Republic.
Ah, I thought so. A procession. There they are, gathered under the skull and ready to go.
Ah, non mi sbagliavo. Una processione.
The world that Elizabeth was defending at the Priory is well represented by this 15th century ring.
So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of this. It's slightly promotional, I apologize for that. And obviously it did use a king and queen, a Cosimo de' Medici character, but he's literally the only character of that sort that we have in any of the apps. It was an experiment to see whether it would make any difference if we chose people that people might have heard of. It turns out not really. I chose, just for the running screen that you're going to see in the background, a guide character here, Marietta, who is an orphan in the orphanage of Florence. And this instead is a trail that basically takes guide character, the visitor, through the sites of hospitals.
Marietta, and welcome to Florence. I'll bet you've seen the big sites already. Our great cathedral, the baptistry, the palazzo where Duke Cosimo lives with Duchess Eleonora. It's 1561, and I've lived my whole life under the rule of Duke Cosimo. Duke Cosimo de' Medici. He's a clever one, that's for sure. Everything runs like a well-maintained clock on.
Anyway, so you get the picture. Essentially, the character is an orphan brought up in the famous Hospital of the Innocents. Here we're a little closer to the history of science, in the sense that these are places of welfare in the fabric of the city. And as you walk through the city in the company of the character, you basically move through a number of these different sites. I'm just clicking through quickly just to kind of give you a flavor of this. I'm cutting out all the audio track just for the 10 minutes, for the sake of 10 minutes. We combine an audio narrated by the character, informed by historical sources, with what we call Discover More audio, which is, on the other hand, provided by the academics that essentially contributed to the project. In this case, work that was created by Julia Rombo and Nicholas Terpstra at the University of Toronto. So that's the Florence example. just to give you the sort of standard layout of these apps, these are basically formed to a standardized layout, and you'll see why in a minute. But broadly speaking, all the apps have a guide character. They all use a historical map. Recently, we've introduced a feature for multiple maps so that you can do the sort of time travel experience in more than one period. But we started out in the early modern because that's the period that the team were working on. So there's a map, there's a historical character, there are sites in the city. And the point is that essentially by inscribing the history of locations and objects together onto particular sites, you bring together what Henri Lefebvre's triangle of person, place, object, and to create meaning. In this case, for example, on the right-hand side, you're seeing the first turkey bones probably found in Britain, which were eaten in a luxury townhouse in central Exeter. And the guide takes you to a otherwise unexceptional dark alley, which was originally part of that house, the find site of the bones. So in a sense, you're bringing back together the find, which in a cabinet would otherwise not be very meaningful. More recently, very recently, about 2 weeks ago, we launched Hidden Copenhagen, done in collaboration with colleagues in Copenhagen. And in this story, we essentially told a very complicated story told through the eyes of Niels, a student, a medical student who essentially assists at the first public dissection or an early dissection of a corpse in Copenhagen by Nicholas Steno, a dissection which was subsequently published, fully published. The character the character narrates the story, but the subject of the dissection was a woman who'd been accused of infanticide, and we essentially learn about the story and, in a sense, in a Foucauldian sense, the anatomized body played out across the various institutions of the city. I don't know why it's not going forward. Oh yeah, and here I've got a sort of bit of audio, just a little bit of video that shows you that process. This is how the apps work. You choose your character, you download the walk, the map appears. You can see you can move between one map type and another. Here's your character.
I should look where I'm going. Head my lecture notes as usual.
And the characters, all the apps are narrated in English and the home and at least the host language. So in this case, in Danish. In countries where there may be more than or a contested language issue. So in Valencia, it's Spanish and Catalan. In Trento, it's German and Italian. And I'm not going to take you through all this, but broadly speaking, you go through the different sites. At the sites, you get an element of the story, which is triggered by finding an item.
Ah, you found it. The anatomy house. This is where I spent the last 10 days scribbling while Steno carved up that corpse.
A little bit too playful, perhaps, but you know, we were using student actors. Then there's a Hear More, in which
the image on your screen was based on Steno's own drawings from this dissection. It represents the circulation of blood Niels refers to.
And so essentially you get a combination of two levels, and then a third level which links to a website where you can read more about the research that underpins the work. So the idea for an academic is that it's a way also of accompanying them from their comfortable space back, so to speak, to the much more public history narrative space, which they might be less familiar with. As I mentioned, as the promotional stuff said, for some slightly random reason, we were lucky that Apple noticed our work. They seem to like it. And if you search for any of the cities we've done a trail for, there's an app trail. There's a maps feature a guide feature in their Maps app, which the blue line there shows you has helped with download numbers. And I'm going to finish off. There's a book about it that's free, it's open access. And we're also using this in teaching because the CMS, which is the back end that basically speaks to the researchers, is helping us essentially do the same process with our students. And that's turned out to be very productive. We've also done some work in terms of post-COVID sort of consultation, citizen consultation on the future of the high street in the way that they were using the citizens, our local community in Exeter was invited to use the app to sort of learn a bit more about the city in which they live. I think that's probably it. Yes, I'm sorry, I probably also went over 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Fabrizio. And our third and final speaker is Alexis Peck. Alexis Peck is currently Director of Digital Engagement and a member of the leadership team at the Science History Institute in Philadelphia, where she uses archives and collections to tell stories across multiple digital mediums. She oversees She's award-winning Distillations digital content platform and is also co-host of the Distillations podcast. Alexis Peck also serves as director of Innate, How Science Invented the Myth of Race, a National Endowment for the Humanities funded podcast and magazine project that explores the historical roots and persistent legacies of racism in American science and medicine. Finally, she is on the record in an interview saying that if she didn't have this existing work profile, quote, I'd want to be a librarian or an archivist, and I'd also take professional D&D player if that's an option, unquote. So something for you to ask her about in the Q&A. Take it away, Alexis.
Hello. All right. Can you hear me? Okay, great. All right. Then I am going to share my screen here. And let's see. Can you see all those slides? Fantastic. All right. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about audio stories. That's a huge part of my work. That's kind of how I do a lot of our storytelling. So the Science History Institute, we have what's called distillations, and distillations is really, think about it like digital storytelling in all sorts of ways. So we have two podcasts, the Distillations and the Disappearing Spoon, with the historian of the author Sam Keene. And we also have Distillations, our magazine, which is visual stories. And then we do a lot of videos, short films, documentaries, that sort of thing. So for us, it's really a place to take a topic, the history of science, which oftentimes for people can feel like a thing. They go, oh my God, I remember high school chemistry. Oh God, no. And to say, no, this science is for you. Science is for everyone. You are all welcome here, and sort of bring people in. So I'm going to start this out sort of talking about podcasts specifically, right? The 6 phases of podcast production is really answering this question, sort of how do you make an audio story about the history of science? And so we kind of go with coming up with the story, researching, which is where we read, talk to incredible people and read 10,000 books, gathering tape, which for us is interviewing all those people, talking to them, getting their voices, sort of figuring out where that story is, scripting, that painful process where we take all that and turn it, into a coherent narrative that fits in, 45 minutes or less, and then tracking where we record, or I should say, I sit in front of a microphone and my producers tell me how to pronounce words and make me say lines 13 times over so that by the time you hear it, it's perfect. And then mixing, where our audio engineer and our producers get in and kind of make it all sound beautiful and whatnot. But I wanted to talk about this in context of a specific project that we did. And I really wanted to focus on the storytelling part of that, because I feel like that's something we're really, that's kind of key. And so for us, we worked on this project called Innate, How Science Invented the Myth of Race. And it is, the centerpiece is podcast season, but there were also magazine articles, we had live events, we had YouTube events, we did stuff on social media. It was sort of a big thing, and we really wanted to get at this sort of idea that we kind of had half-heartedly like a few years ago. We were like, we'd love to talk about race and science. And we thought, well, maybe we could do it in an episode or two. And we'll just kind of like get to the bottom of it naively. And that ballooned. The more we read, the more we talked with people, the more we thought about what we really wanted to do with this project. It sort of exploded and became massive. And we were really lucky to get an NEH grant to do it. I will drop the link in the chat so you guys can go and check out the page and you can listen to all the episodes. But what I really wanted to talk about is what guides us and what guided us through this process, and what I think can guide lots of people through this process of doing sort of digital storytelling. And I think about this quote from John Lewis: never ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. And I think one of the things that's really powerful about telling an audio story, about working with a podcast, is that you have this opportunity to bring in multiple voices. You have this opportunity to complicate a narrative, because we oftentimes treat history as if there is one thread, there is one story, there's one person with the right order that things went in, and we just follow it along. And that's actually not how it is, right? There's always lots of different narratives. There's lots of different perspectives. There's lots of different complications, and we should be talking about all of that. And when we don't talk about all that, that's what allows us to take a topic like, say, racism, which is complicated and hard and frankly maybe sometimes sad and painful to talk about. I know it was sad and painful to make it. It makes us shy away from that because it's hard to put it in a nice, neat narrative where one person tells you what comes next, and it's all put in that way. And I think podcasts, because by virtue of how you do them, I should say ours is a narrative podcast, so we bring in lots of voices, we really focus on storytelling, allows you to do that. And so we are sort of taking what is, this is a photograph of some of the books we read for the season. On the shelf there, you'll see Superior, Fatal Invention by Dorothy Roberts. I mean, we sort of called these all our Bibles that were guiding us through this process. And so what we really tried to do, and we were lucky enough to talk to a lot of these people and many, many more scholars, is to take all of these different perspectives, all of these different angles, and take them in different episodes and break them down into bite-sized pieces that people could digest. And our hope is that, this becomes the beginning of a process for someone. It's not meant it's 10 episodes. I got to tell you, we've not solved all of racism. We didn't cover all of racism in 10 episodes. Spoiler alert. But really, our hope is that this allows people to dive in and to get started on that journey. And that's another thing that I think is really vital about digital storytelling, about using these tools, is that sometimes we get hung up on kind of, oh my gosh, is it right? Are all the facts there? Or all the, have we done, is it doing everything? And I don't think these tools have to do everything. I think these tools can be a gateway into people finding a topic that they want to know more about, finding things they want to read more about, or ask more questions, or to think about it in a way that maybe hasn't occurred to them before. And maybe they were a little bit uncomfortable, but now they've been through this journey that's been, it's been curated for them, and it's helpful in that process. So I think about this as part of creating a door. And so the one little trick I want to talk about that we use is the E, and that's getting into sort of story structure. We always want to start somewhere kind of present, right? So you're starting, let's see if I can get this laser pointer to work. So you're starting sort of somewhere in the present, it's today. And again, for us as storytellers, it helps to bring people in, meet people where they are to start that story. So we're hanging out here and it's the present. And at some point we want to loop back, but we're not trying to loop. We're trying to loop all the way back and sort of tell you how you got there, right? So we're at the present. Let's see if it's working. And then we're kind of looping back to the beginning, right? Some really far distant point in history, kind of, if we can go where it all began. So when we did Innate, we really, really went back to the beginning. We went back to the history quote unquote, the history of the world in the Nuremberg Chronicles. And so that is kind of like, we went as far back as we could go. And then we try to bring people sort of midway up in history. So somewhere kind of in the middle, and then bring them back to the present again. And that sounds sort of like crazy to kind of like describe as a structure maybe for doing storytelling. But we found it's really, really worked. So I'll give you another example for our yellow fever episode. We started present day. We were lucky enough to live near the Lazaretto in Philadelphia. And so this was kind of tail end of COVID. Me and my producer went out there. We talked to David Barnes there, and we were sort of walking around the site, and we were talking about kind of putting people in space and time. What does it look like today? And one of the things we wanted to talk about in that episode is about how yellow fever, in some ways, is kind of a mirror. We're talking about largely a Black population in the city that was essentially used as essential workers, right? Who were out there during yellow fever, told that they couldn't get it out of this sort of foundational misbelief that Black people were somehow immune to yellow fever. And then after they nursed all the sick and dying and died themselves, essentially, to talk about, you know, how afterwards people were like, kicking it apart and sort of saying, oh, you did the wrong things, or accusing them of doing different things. And so we wanted to tell that story, but telling it just in order from beginning to end sort of follows that same practice I talked about earlier, kind of making people feel like history is this thing where everything happens neatly in one order and there's one way to know it. And so we started in the present, and then we went all the way back to Richard Allen, and we talked about sort of how Richard Allen, he led the church that they came to and asked to for volunteers. We talked about Richard Allen, his past, how he came to be, and gave that as a grounding. And then we sort of moved back up in time to talk about what happened after yellow fever and during yellow fever, and then brought people back to the present again. And that allowed us to bring in a lot of different voices, to ask a lot of complicated questions, and I think to really tell a fuller story. And that's something we can do specifically because this is an audio medium, because it's digital. We're able to jump around like that, right? We have that freedom. We can bring in, you know, 35 seconds of someone answering a question. We can take people through different periods of time. We at some point had an actor reading, Richard Allen wrote an account of the experience, and we had an actor that came in that read that diary live, and we put in music and we put in sound effects from under the city and all of that sort of stuff to sort of make that moment come alive. And that's something we could do because of the flexibility of digital, because of telling an audio story. And so even though books are incredible, words are incredible, writing is incredible, we definitely support that. I mean, we have a magazine, of course, we think that's important. Using this other medium allowed us to tell a fuller story. And I think in some ways a better story, because it's a more complicated story. It's a messier story. It is a story that we hope makes people feel a little uncomfortable, and yes, hopeful, and yes, want to do things about it for the future, but to make people sort of look in that mirror and go, ooh, okay, the world as I had put it in these little boxes actually doesn't quite work like that. And so that is, let's see if I can get this pointer now to go off. And so the part I want to close with, I want to keep myself to my 10 minutes. I'm sorry if I'm going a little over. So the part I want to close with, this is some behind the scenes photos of us both recording, and we were also on the left-hand side of the screen, the one where we're talking to a woman who was working with, we did a story about the MOVE bombing and the skulls that were at the University of Pennsylvania. And we were talking to one of the students who had been involved in that process and in that movement and in calling for the school to make change. And so we brought her in and interviewed her. And here you'll kind of see in the background is parts from our season trailer. where we were trying to figure out what bits and pieces of the things that we recorded do we use to make up a trailer to sort of give people a sense of what this season is going to be about. So we use a program called Descript, and it's basically, without getting too audio nerdy about you, with all of you, you can pull in all of your audio clips. It does transcripts. It also does video, a whole bunch of things. But what's important there, I want you to see, is that each speaker and piece of audio is a different color. And so you'll see there, you can see, let's see if I can get this laser pointer again. So you can see my name is here. Then you can see Angela Saini is here. Dorothy Roberts, Dummy Track is just another name for pre-recorded tape that I did. There's more Angela. You can see there's some archival down here. You'll see music. And my point about including this is that this, even a season trailer for us, ends up being a layer of all of these voices who all gave us different perspectives, who all allowed us to tell a much richer story. And I think about this a lot, being in this field as a woman of color, kind of what kinds of stories do we tell? Who do we include in those narratives? Whose voices do we highlight? Do we prioritize? Let's be honest, a lot of times it's not women who look like me, right? And so what we wanted to make sure we did was think about who those voices were that we were highlighting, so that we weren't just talking about this topic, but we were talking about this topic with voices from a community, from my community, who's deeply invested in it. And so I hope that gives you a little bit of insight into for us, how we think about how digital can help us tell better stories, can help us talk about science and history, and again, some of these complicated topics. Also fun topics too. Before this, we've done stories on vampires and on using video games for storytelling, on tech bros in California trying to live forever and get immortality. So we definitely try to run the gamut and tell people all sorts of stories, but this kind of grounds our work. And this is our approach that we use, whether we are asking questions about racism and science and how that's become foundational to this country, to many countries, or a smaller, lighter question like, how did the laser get invented? And so I will leave you there with that, and that, I think, is my time.
Thank you so much, Alexis. Okay, my internet was lagging, but I think I'm back. I wanted to then give you all a chance, since you are the experts, to sort of interrogate, have a question and answer with one another. But I want to just let people know before we do that, if you want, you can post your question and answer in the Q&A down at the bottom of the Zoom webinar. And again, for those folks who are on Discord, some of those will be transferred over to this Q&A, but if you're on YouTube, be sure to make sure you log on to the Zoom webinar to ask your question. And I can see there's lots of very clever people who have joined us as participants. So to give you a little time, those of you who are participants, would you like to talk to each other for a little while, ask each other questions? And if so, just go at it.
Okay, well, I guess I'll just jump in. Some of this is just sort of observation that relates to some of the things we've heard. So I'll start with Fabrizio. So as you were talking about these fantastic apps for really getting a feel for the city in ways that you typically don't, it reminded me that the National Academies of Science in Washington, D.C., there was a person there that I worked with and had some interactions with at another immersive series called DASER. It's kind of an awkward, it's an acronym for an awkward full name, which is DC Area Art Science Evening Rendezvous. So this was really all about the intersections of art and science. And there would be these monthly gatherings there. But one of the people involved there had put together a sort of a hyper local app like the ones you've been describing for cities, but for the NAS building itself, which is just filled with all kinds of symbology of science, of disciplines, and historical figures. And what you could do is just aim the phone, at a particular object in the building, and then you would get some of these enhanced kind of information sources like you have in these wonderful apps that you show. This makes me want to go traveling immediately. It also made me want to work with you on a couple of other ones, particularly sort of focusing in on science tourism. In Delft, for example, I would love to work with you on one that focuses on Leeuwenhoek, the father of microbiology. Fantastic stories to be told there, and I could see this being wonderful. I mean, maybe the government of Delft would want to fund us to do that. But I see so many opportunities here. Prague is another example. My wife and I were there some years ago, and I saw it out. Is there some science tourism there? Is there somebody who can take us on a kind of geeky tour, of the city? And I could not find that. It might just be that I didn't find it and it was there, but I have a feeling that it wasn't. So I just think that you're starting something that has a tremendous amount of potential. And then moving to Alexis, just an observation. I just love the way you are taking, this podcast and this audio framework, in ways, you're sort of using the medium, in ways in the full potential that it has, so compared to, you weren't in initially when I was talking about my Voices from DARPA podcast, which was in some ways most of the times in the simplest format it could be, me and a podcaster a program manager at DARPA, a technology developer, between two firms, talking about the personal history and then what role they're playing in technology development in this institution, DARPA. At times, I went in the ambitious direction that you went, which was to bring more voices in. So there was one, and these are more like radio documentaries, right? Audio documentaries. And in that case, I brought about four, in one of those examples, it was about kind of next generation electronics. And I brought in 4 or 5 different voices, some from the technology development side, some from the industry side, way more, as you know, because the labor intensity of that is really something else. But in the end, really worth it. So more observations than questions, and I'll mute myself now for everybody's benefit.
Oh my gosh, thank you. It's not for the faint of heart. You're right. We interviewed probably, over 100 people for this season. The file was actually so large, we had to call the script and say, how do we archive this? Because it's gigantic. And they're like, this is crazy. For sure. I'm so glad you brought that up about the tours. I guess, Fabrizio, you're popular. I've been thinking about the tours. I worked at Laurel Hill Cemetery many years ago, and we had a walking tour that was about using just stories about the cemetery, people who were buried there. And I'm looking at what you guys have done, and it's fantastic. And I love the sort of idea of feeling the person who's bringing you along is actually a tour guide, is actually sort of has a personality and kind of has a background. And I just I'm obsessed with that. I think that's genius.
That's your cue, Fabrizio.
Yeah, no, I got it. Well, I'm not really quite sure how. They both seemed like comments, really, and I guess so. It's really fantastic to get good responses. Obviously, the thing about telling stories about places is that there's as many stories as you want to tell about as many places you want to tell them about. They can be quite scientific and kind of for science geeks, but likewise they can, but identifying your audience is obviously one of the key things. And in this context, I would be absolutely happy to discuss, possible future projects. A lot of this stuff, unfortunately, is to some extent governed by the funding, right? So in my case, I think so. I'm not in a museum, nor am I. You two are coming from a slightly different position in relation to the research. In my case, most of the time this has been in the UK. They have something called impact. That's a sort of requirement, or increasingly a requirement from research. And this was, in the first instance, was an attempt to respond to that challenge. You know, how do we create impact from something that I want to learn about anyway? And then it's kind of slightly because it kind of works and people sort of are interested, and it's begun to have more impetus of its own. And in a sense, and this is kind of going maybe to Rebecca Martin's comment in the chat, and I'll read that out for those that maybe can't hear it, see it. For Fabrizio and Ivan, but it feels to me like this is maybe for everybody. Could you talk a little about whether, if so, how you approach more difficult topics like discrimination, race, gender, empire, colonialism, etc., within your projects? And I would say that, you know, obviously I'm not saying the place we began our projects with is in a particular past where none of that applies. Of course, I'm not saying that. But a number of those particular topics have become more and more of interest as we've developed our methodology, in a sense. So at the beginning, it was more a question of, so how might we represent a working class, the wool worker in Florence, as opposed to the position of the wool industry, which funded most of the artworks that we're looking at. And our first character was very much informed by that point of view. So to some extent, class, to some extent, but certainly class, and to some extent discrimination, to some extent, if you like, the creation of canon. You know, when you're talking about Renaissance Florence, there are all sorts of assumptions that you make, and they're normally informed by the people that are paying for the artworks and the people that are looking at them today. And as we've gone along, I think that's become more and more the space I'm interested in. That is how this approach, rather than just simply being a form of public history or a way of communicating with wider publics, is a way of actually surfacing stories. That's why I very glancingly referenced critical fabulation, but surfacing stories that just simply don't get told, that aren't in the archive. So even the little character I very briefly presented, Marietta, there would be many Marias in the archive. There will be many Maria degli Innocenti, because it's the most common surname still to this day in Tuscany. But many of those people would not have any archival record other than the day that they were left in the orphanage. And so in a sense, it's a matter of reading against the archive to tell those stories and figure out how might they have operated within the city that was dominated by Cosimo the Duke to have their particular lives. And I think as we move into other cities, into other periods, so I think a number of these issues that were in the question will become more and more into focus. And we've got a future project, which I won't talk about because it's not funded, which specifically will look to co-create stories with the publics that are visiting the locations, asking them which the stories that they would like to hear are, rather than, in a sense, us going in with a pre-formulated idea that we need to address discrimination, race, gender, empire, and colonialism, but rather to actually see how much will that come out already, simply by the fact that people want a different way of narrating the place that we're perhaps working with on that particular instance. Anyway, that was rather a long, general, rambling question, but I hope it addresses some of what you've asked.
I'm gonna follow that
briefly.
Yes, briefly. So and not nearly as substantially. And the first response is that I did in both of the cases that I was talking about. So DARPA, the Voices from DARPA podcast, as well as DC Science Cafe. That had I to do them over again, I would have inserted the intentionality, actually focus or include these issues that you bring up in the question from the get-go. So there was not a complete absence, but certainly a less of an intentionality regarding these issues in both of these projects than I would like. That said, there were sporadic, there's a couple of instances in each case, so a couple of the programs in the podcast series, as well as the DC Science Cafe, did focus on sort of systemic discrimination and racism. So in one case, I did bring in one of really actually the only Black program manager at the time at DARPA, and was able to speak with him really about the challenges that he confronted growing up, both as a young person and then through his educational system, and then getting into crossing that chasm of going from sort of an education and some kind of professional beginning and then getting to be a program manager. Every program manager has their kind of how did I get to DARPA story, and so we're able to speak with that there. And then just one of the DC Science Cafe events that I remember in this context was bringing an historian in who was really looking at the Black experience in the beginning and evolution of NASA, which had, I think, an early pretty good record there. In fact, bringing in, women Black mathematicians, and this has become parts of movies and their central role in working out incredibly important, orbitals and aspects of the early space age that we think about now as iconic in that high technology. So that was part of one of the DC Science Cafes. But again, if I were to pick these up again, I would want to bring that intentionality in from the get-go and have much more representation of those issues.
Thank you, Ivan. I want to subvert my own suggested format and ask the question that's been asked of Alexis by the hosts. Alexis, do you know who listens to your podcast and how you advertise it? Is it simply available on all the usual services, Google, Apple, Amazon Music, Spotify? I think we've managed to post the link to Innate, but do you want to say more about accessibility?
Sure. So yes, you can get Distillations anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple, Overcast, whoever your favorite podcast streaming services, you can get Distillations. So you just look up the show Distillations, you'll get our current season, which is Innate. And so we podcast stats are funny. So we know kind of where people are listening from, like what country, and we know like numbers of people and things like where they get their platforms. I think as of, I guess, the beginning of maybe the first three, I can tell you the first 3 months of Innate, we've had about 30 or 40,000 downloads so far. And so then we can sort of broadly say, okay, this many came from the UK, this many came from Brazil, this many came from the US, et cetera. But we can't tell, unlike Facebook or Instagram or any of those other things, we can't tell like, oh my gosh, you like pickles and you live in this part of the city and we know like far less information about you, which is, probably for the best. We have actually, our podcast has been around for 13 years, or 14, I guess now. We are one of the longest running, I think, museum podcasts, and we've evolved a lot over that time. I mean, we started out just like interviews, like very simple, like very like standard, like one person talking. We were not even like, Ivan, you were talking to lots of different people. We were like barely doing that. And so we've grown a lot into being this narrative audio sort of documentary storytelling. And so, because we're situated in a museum, we have the communications department. So, we advertise on social media. We tell people about it who are coming to the museum. We've been lucky enough to make work that has been picked up by other radio stations and things like that. So, that's how we've been getting the word out there. So we know it's pretty well listened to. We've been lucky enough to be on some top best of lists, that sort of thing. But one thing we do know for sure, sort of based on people who have come to our live shows and stuff like that, is that our audience is not, we have plenty of practitioners who listen. We have plenty of scholars and academics who listen, but our audience is not people who are, I would say, inside the field, right? We have a really broad public audience who actually love sort of storytelling and history, and they're listening to Serial and things like that, and so. That for us, Fabrizio, you said something really important, I think earlier about knowing your audience. And so for us, we know we are always talking to people who are experts, but like experts in things that are not like necessarily what our topic is. And so we try to make sure that that guides our storytelling. So we're not kind of making assumptions about like, well, everyone knows this concept, so we're not even going to explain it, right? We are, to borrow from you, I've been being intentional about sort of what we're saying, how we're telling that story, because we kind of know who we're talking to about it. So that's a long answer.
No, it's a great answer. Thank you. I just want to remind people, if you're feeling shy, you can still post a Q&A down at the bottom. Also, the links that we're talking about, including the link for the DARPA podcast, including Alexis's link for the Innate podcast, down in the resources tab. We'll toggle, we can only activate one link at a time, so we'll toggle between them, and hopefully everybody will pick those up. And while we're waiting for public questions, I think I will start to ask mine and just sort of try to think about questions that go across the different presentations we've been given. One set of questions I have is about accessibility. So it maybe builds off of the last question about, Alexis, who accesses your podcast, but also maybe connects to, Fabrizio, you called this public history work. So I think that's really interesting. And it made me think about Deborah Boyer's article in the April 2016 National Council of Public History. It was called Finding the Intersection of Technology and Public History, in which she argued, quote, digital technology has enabled public historians, cultural heritage professionals, and history students to collaborate with diverse audiences and explore history's role in civic engagement in ways that are previously unimaginable. It has also demonstrated the exciting possibilities as well as the challenges that advanced digital tools provide, especially in the face of limited budgets, long software development cycles, and varying levels of digital access. Public historians must keep both challenges in mind from the beginning of project development if they hope to reach a diverse audience who will share the project with others. And Ivan, I didn't involve you in this question, but one could imagine a similar series of questions about the interactive media of science cafes, because although these are not technologies per se, the structure and situatedness, the kind of placeness, whether you do it in person, which venue you choose, all of those things kind of shape questions about accessibility. So any or all of you, can you reflect more on these generalizations about accessibility for the public historian and the use of technologies or other forms? Or you could just do it more specifically through the process of your own creative process when devising immersive storytelling ventures.
Okay, well, I'll dive in first. And partly I'm doing this is because I also want to apologize to everybody here that I have to leave at 1:25. I have another meeting that I cannot get out of. And so my apologies in advance for that. Yeah, the accessibility, this was also very important for me, particularly, well, really in both of the things I've spoken about, the cafe and the podcast. So just, as is the practice for science communicators who are really trying to reach the public, we do, in any case, if there's any jargon, any difficult language, we really try to explain that and not just keep using an acronym, for example, without saying what that is, or assuming that people know something that we think maybe most people do. Trying to really get back into that mindset of before you knew what you know now, right? So that's sort of a strategic driver for both of these. My role as the facilitator in the Science Cafe events was to make sure that my discussion leaders were speaking in accessible ways. And so, if they're going off into a jargon direction, which I would coach them ahead of time not to do, but as we all know when we work with PhDs, they often do go into these directions that are really hard for a wide audience to understand. So
Alexis is nodding knowingly.
Yes, I should see that. So I would coach ahead of time to try to, sort of preempt going into an inaccessible direction. But when that did happen, I would just challenge the discussion leaders to recast what they're saying in a way for people who are not special, people who do not share their specialty. And then on the other side, there are times when people in the audience would have a question, they're having a bit of a hard time articulating it. I then would help also on that side. I usually would be able to discern really what they're trying to get at and then kind of recast the question. So there was that kind of two-way accessibility. So that's one answer there. I mean, I can leave it at that just so other people have opportunity.
Because you're approaching it through the lens of language and kind of ways that the communicator communicates language. Alexis and Fabrizio, do you want a chance to respond?
You want to go first, Alexis? But I'm happy to respond.
Yeah, no, I think I just like, I nodded my head so much, Ivan, you were saying so many things that we definitely go through. And I love that point you made about sort of you as a host being like a connector and helping sort of bridge those gaps, because I feel like that's a really important tool that we always sort of forget about. I mean, so for us, I mean, accessibility wise, just broadly speaking, I mean, we have transcripts for all of our shows on our websites. You know, we try to like that way, like you can still come and like read along. We've been doing that for a few years now, and it's a painstaking process, but we think it's really worth it. But from a public point of view, like in terms of talking to a public audience, you know, I'll echo a lot of the same things that Ivan says. And I think also, you know, I don't come at this from a science background. I come at this from a history background and a storyteller background. And so I think it's always good that a lot of times I walk into a room and I'm not an expert. And I think that helps me be able to say, okay, when I'm getting in the weeds, when I'm getting lost here, this is a place where we really need to focus in and make sure we're making this clear for our audience and try to help people figure out what stuff needs to be cut, what stuff don't we need to get at what the core story is, because people can always read more. People can always ask follow-up questions. People can always dive in deeper. I think, like I said, of us is creating a doorway. And so that's kind of how we try to approach it. And
I wasn't nodding, but I was agreeing with a lot of what everybody was saying. I mean, just from the sort of the sort of technicalities of the accessibility, I mean, we're learning as we're going along, we're adding new things as we go along. I would say one of the, you know, at one level, the thing we learned soonest, and this is going back also to one of the questions about how do people get this, what do we know about our audiences? But one of the things we learned soonest through the very low level analytics that we get is that a lot more people are using these apps distance mode, armchair mode than on location. So in some ways, that's already an accessibility issue. You do not need to travel to Florence or Valencia to try out these apps. And so there is some element at which there is a crossover between the app and a podcast mode, right? Because in a sense, it's something that through the map, you can interact with the spaces and the places. And if you want to, you can extend that through Street View and things like that. So there is a sort of distance modeness of all of this. And to be honest, you know, even when we do that work with students, it's all done in distance mode. They get to go and see often what they did visiting a location after the event, but the whole learning is actually learnt remotely. I'm not in England because I'm just trying out a new one of these things we've just made in a place called Landshut near Munich in Germany. And with the sort of income of that particular project, we've built in an accessibility feature, which basically makes transcripts available for all the trails. And we're going to be implementing that backwards. We're going to put that into all the existing content, into all the existing apps as we kind of go forward. I think that's probably, accessibility. That's what we were talking about, right? I'm wondering if there was anything else, if I missed.
I'm actually just going to dive in almost with a contrarian revelation regarding DC Science Cafe. And I used to sometimes slate it, even promote it as defiantly live, right? So we did not actually film these or live stream them. I mean, this was in some ways railing against what was becoming an ever more virtual experience of just life, so I didn't do that. Now, that's partly, I don't want to say laziness, because there was a lot of effort to put these together, but it did have something to do with, sort of lack of, labor help, right? So I did not, there was only so many elements of putting these things together that I could handle. And so I just didn't want to monitor social media. Yeah, I see, Karen, you're saying something?
Yeah, because we only have you for 3 minutes and we have a question for you in the chat.
Oh, okay.
So.
Anyway, so the point being is that
Yeah.
those cafes were, as I say, defiantly live. Some of them actually were filmed by partners who came in with cameras, but for the most part, they were not accessible in that way where most of these kinds of events are. So yes, the question is.
I feel like that interviewer on NPR where they say 30 seconds.
That's right.
Here's the question. Ivan's comment that the cafe audiences are a cross-section of the DC population is really striking. Is that really true in terms of working across current sharp political divides? How do these activities reach across these boundaries, especially when they deal with race and other controversial issues? Asked Jim Secor.
Great catch. And the answer is, you're right. I mean, it is not representative in those ways that you're talking, and in others. My view of this was really narrow, which is to say, it wasn't just the science interested. It was now the science curious of even people who were coming in just off the street, who might be coming to the restaurant, not for anything but a drink or a meal, and say, oh, this is interesting. So the context in which I was saying that, and it really is narrow, it is, normally the audiences I reach are those who are going to go to the science page, go to, Tuesday Science Times and read that. That's their favorite thing of the week. They're the ones that typically, in the past, I've been probably reaching more often. In this case, I'm saying it's more the general public, science interested or not, but it doesn't cross, not against all those, categories of race, nationality, political standing, and all of that. I could not claim that it was, representative that way. So good point.
All right, thank you, Ivan. I want to give you a chance to exit gracefully with 1 minute to spare.
Okay, so I'll go dark first. I just want to thank everybody, Karen, and Fabrizio and Alexis. I'm going to want to do some follow-up offline for all of those who took some time to listen in with us and join the conversation too. I thank you for joining and for the ways you've made me think.
We're not over. Ivan is just leaving.
Right, just me. So stay as long, and Karen, I'll want to get a debrief later. So see you.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess maybe with the time we have left, since there aren't any more questions yet, hint, hint, in the Q&A, I'll ask my last question, Fabrizio and Alexis, which is really a question that maybe kind of is a bridge to the next session. And it's a question about, the way that I think about it is, Esther Perel talks about, most relationship problems are not problems to be solved, they're paradoxes to be managed. And so I'm thinking about the paradox to manage in the activity of creating immersive tools for teaching history and historical thinking. So what I would think of is like the slippages between historical realities and truths, for lack of a better word, and historical play and memory making. Those kind of slippages between those things really do, it seems you've made powerful cases that these create spaces for increased engagement and agency in history making, and especially for recentering previously ignored voices in the history of science, perhaps even containing the possibility for remaking what Patricia Martins Marcos has called, quote, the enduring coloniality of available conceptual frameworks. So maybe kind of building off of what Fabrizio said about Hartman's critical fabulations framework, there's been a critique that these kinds of slippages in certain media, particularly now I'm thinking about games, I'm thinking about Brett Devereaux's critique that these kind of slippages exist, but they may not be visible or interrogated in certain media. The things like the systems and the mechanics of a video game or an app. And here I'm thinking about Luca Ivan Jukic's article in The Atlantic in 2022, talking about the video game EU4, which advance notice, I don't play and I don't know anything about, but I thought it was interesting the argument made that the game involved the roles of nation states. And if taken at face value, it is true that nation states were powerful, but in the game, nation states were capable of doing something that was portrayed kind of overly simplistically and sanitized compared to the reality. So for example, taking over another nation in real time, again, historical truth, actuality might involve genocide or cultural assimilation, which is incredibly slow, not like a kind of immediate conversion that happens by achieving certain things in a video game. So I'm wondering if one or both of you have any reflections on sort of managing the paradigms of alternative forms of immersive history and historical thinking. How do you think about this paradox as a creator? How do you think about it as a participator in immersive historical creations or world making?
This is a good question. Do you want me to go first, Fabrizio? Do you want to go first? Okay. So I think I talked a little bit about this on the Discord, and I think I've said this over and over again. You know, I come from a perspective where I am maybe less concerned about those slippages than maybe other people are, and certainly I think it's good to sort of know where a game or whatever immersive experience you have, like where it stops, like how far does it go, and what are the things that it skips over, what are the things it compresses. I think it's good to know that and to state that up front. But I think the question that we often forget to ask is, why is an audience participating in this, and what are they going to go on to do after they participate in it? So I think about, we did this, there's this book series called Discovery of Witches that's written by Deborah Harkness, and we've had the fan con at the museum, we've had them on the podcast, I'm like, spoiler alert, like huge fan. And you know, we talked with her about it, and she was saying, you know, early on people were like, well, you know, you're writing about like vampires and witches and like magic, and like, isn't this going to be sort of like confuse people, and like it's not real, and blah blah blah. And she kind of had that whole point about gateways. And when we held the fan con at the museum, one of the things that was really fascinating is that, you know, we had over 300 people who came, we were packed, and they were here to see the real versions and to hear about the history that had been hinted about in these books that they loved. And so they were here to look at like, oh, they talked about this rare book from this person in chapter 36. I want to see what that's like in real life. Oh, wait. They were talking about this guy from history. Is that person real? I want to know more about them. And so like, it was just this moment that reminded me that like, it is, sometimes we're so caught up in sort of what the immersive experience, what the tool is doing, we forget that it's about opening a gateway and guiding people on the rest of that journey and giving them lots of tools to learn and go after that, and before that. And so that's why for me, as long as we're honest and we know what those limitations are and we're upfront about those limitations, I'm less concerned that they exist. In fact, I'd love to see us spend more time and more energy thinking about what comes after this. If somebody loves it and they go down this rabbit hole, what else do we have for them so that they can keep on diving deeper? And so that's kind of my perspective on it, which may or may not be controversial.
No, I think the thing of the gateway that you said in your talk connects to what you're saying now. So that's really helpful. Fabrizio, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know how strictly you want to keep to your time, but I mean, basically, I agree with everything there. I think, obviously, from my perspective, in a way, as an academic in a university, the reality is that most of us, historians, art historians, architects, whoever the history discipline you're talking about, you publish something, it goes in an article, how many people are going to download it? How many people are going to read it? A book, printed, if you're lucky, 200 copies. So looked at from the other perspective is that we are just creating all this stuff that nobody looks at. And from the beginning, I had a real problem with that. I mean, I don't mind doing specialist research, I do it. But it seems to me that it's insane that we should do that work and not put it out in some way that is digestible by people who are not professional historians. One of the things when I was really worried about when we first did Hidden Florence was I presented it in an academic conference, Renaissance Society of America. I thought, I'm going to get massacred for this because I'm presenting a made-up person. Do you know, I think that this is one of those kind of false things that we all think about, that history is for one thing and fiction is for another, that, you know, Hilary Mantel can do what the equivalent in that writes about 16th century, you know, history isn't allowed to do. And I'm wondering why these people are arguing. I mean, they're both doing a great job. And ultimately, I think, you know, no one has essentially called us out, obviously, for the characters that we've invented. Obviously, if we get the history wrong, they should call us out. You know, if we do something which is fully anachronistic, or is doing something actively wrong, or is, yeah, fine. But actually, I think the thing I've been most surprised in nearly 10 years of doing this stuff is that it's not the moving away from the empirical research that has ever been a problem. And, you know, just like Alexis said, I mean, for me, one of the things that was really interesting was hearing our local museum curators talking about the role of Minecraft as a way into the museum. You know, they build these worlds of, you know, Roman Exeter or Tudor Exeter, and they put characters in there, and people learn about the things, and then they want to go see the artifacts in the museum. Apparently these are the biggest sellout events in a free museum. They sell tickets for these because otherwise there's just too much demand that they ever hold. And so it's just, I think the crossover point is also a really important one, certainly to the kind of the more game end of it. But certainly from my side, yeah, I thought it would be the big problem. It's turned out it's not the big problem. And plus, we don't, I suppose, in a way, the corrective to, not corrective, but the thing that goes parallel with the fabulation side is the microhistory side, that these tend to be, because their histories of place and person and character and so on, they tend to be quite circumscribed. And so to some extent, you can control the content.
Well, unless you want to respond, Alexis, I'll give you the last word.
No, I was just going to say, I think you said that so excellently. 100% agree.
100% each way, so that's great.
So on this page of 100%, we're going to end, I think, with some really interesting thoughts about historical non-binaries between fabulations and microhistories, gateways and doors involving who participates, how, why, what they go on to do. I really want to thank all of our participants, and again, thank the organizers. And I want to encourage you to continue this conversation in an actual session of participating in immersive video games and immersive forms of doing history of science and technology tomorrow. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye until we meet again.